Hi there, and welcome to Where's the Money Gone, the podcast that takes you inside the football boardroom with me, Adrian Goldberg, and Charlie Methven. I'm a West Bromwich Albion season ticket holder. I'm an investigative journalist and author of Where's the Money Gone, the battle for the soul of English football, available now via Byline Books. And Charlie is managing director of Mount Pleasant FC in Jamaica. He's a shareholder of the Belgian club RAEC Mons, formerly a director of both Sunderland and Charlton Athletic, as well as being a boyhood Oxford United fan. And this time we're joined by a special guest, Omar Chaudhuri from London-based 21st Group, which is a sporting intelligence agency. What's one of those when they're at home? We'll be finding out very shortly. 21st Group have worked with clubs as diverse as Tottenham Hotspur and Grimsby Town, as well as clubs in Japan, the United States, and with Red Bird Capital too, who own AC Milan and have a stake in Liverpool. Omar has edited a how-to guide for football club owners and investors called ROI FC, how to stay sane, win matches and grow value owning and operating a football club. ROI means return on investment. Omar, hello, you're right.
Morning, guys. How you both doing?
Yeah, nice to have you on the program. We'll get straight into this, Omar. Normally, Charlie and I have a chat about the weekend's football, but there's so much stuff I want to glean from you. Let's crack straight on. So I love this quote that you've got in your book. This is for potential owners. The central challenge you face is maintaining rational long-term thinking in an inherently irrational environment, which I think most of us would recognize as the football world. I want to explore that a bit in detail, but tell us about the origin story of 21st Group, what your fan story is, and how you got to be involved in this crazy, irrational world of football.
Yeah, so 21st Group was founded in 2013, and we were founded as 21st Club. And the idea was if we were the 21st club in the Premier League, how would we outthink, outsmart the opposition? And that came off the back of a real groundswell around the use of data in football. If people remember, back in 2011, the Moneyball film came out, and there was this realization that American sports were doing data really well, but European football in particular was a long way behind. So that was the kind of, I guess, origin story for the business. And the first few years of the business was very much helping football clubs use data in smarter ways to maximize and optimize their kind of sporting performance. In time, we began to get more involved in the investment landscape. So at the time, a lot of people remember, the middle part of the last decade, a lot more US capital coming into European football and became a lot more, I guess, embedded in some of those conversations and helping owners understand what's the actual cost of investing and owning these clubs, not just the acquisition cost, but the ongoing costs in order to kind of realize an overall vision. And then over time and more recently, we've evolved to realize that the real competitive edge, one of the core parts of the competitive edge is actually how you operate as a club. You can have loads of great ideas around your sporting competitive edge and use of data, and you can be smart about finance. But actually, if you don't get the really boring day-to-day stuff, the operational stuff right, that's where a lot of this stuff falls over and where a lot of clubs aren't disciplined and therefore owners end up losing money. And so our story as a business from 21st Club to now 21st Group, because we sit across a number of different segments in sport, across competitions and federations, media and brands and betting as well. So that's part of the reason we rebranded a few years ago, as well as being across other sports, so golf, cricket, tennis, rugby, and others. But at the heart of the business and what we continue to do is advise owners and investors on investment in football clubs. And so this book, ROIFC, is kind of I guess it's an important moment for the business because it kind of realizes where we are now in terms of advising not just on data and recognizing it's not just about data, it's about the holistic way of managing a football club. And so, yeah, we're really excited to begin to share this with folks in the industry.
So this is a book for prospective owners, prospective investors in football. But I can't believe anybody works in this field without first having had a love of football themselves. Who do you support? Who did you grow up watching?
Yeah, so like any good South Asian child, I grew up supporting Liverpool, Man United. It was Liverpool for me, and so I've supported them since I was a kid. I must admit, working in football, it's kind of diluted my love of Liverpool. I now live in South London. Crystal Palace are my local team, so I try and keep an eye out for them. And then the beauty of working in football, as you'll both know, you have friends, you have clients, you have colleagues who have all kind of been in and around and at different clubs, and so my life scores app is a lot of favoured teams, let's put it that way. But Liverpool remain close to my heart.
Okay. And when it comes to investing in football, and when people come towards you, I guess you'll offer them this book as a starting point. I think as a fan, one of the most cheering aspects of this book is the idea that actually you can outperform your economic background. So clearly there will be levels of club. There will be, if you like, the big six in the Premier League. There'll then be a tier of clubs below that, a tier of clubs like mine, West Brom, who, if they get into the Premier League, spend most of their time simply trying to stay there. But I think one of your key insights is actually the importance of financial backing can be overstated, and that it is very possible for football clubs to punch above their weight.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's ultimately three things that will drive a club's performance. There's how much you spend. So as you say, there are kind of grades of clubs, and that plays an important role, but it's not the only role. There's how well you spend it, which is increasingly playing an important role. And we talk about clubs like Brighton, Brentford, even at the top end, Liverpool, kind of overachieving based on how well they spend it. And the third is luck. You know, football's an inherently very random sport. If you play well on a day, we calculate that the better performing team in a match will only win about 65% of the time. So, you know, one in three, there's a chance they'll drop points on the day. So luck plays a really important role in it. But I suppose it's that middle bit that we really focus on, that how well you spend it, because essentially the correlation between how much you spend and how well you do on the pitch is again only in the region of about 65, 66%. So there's a lot of variation in results that's explained by how well teams spend their money and obviously how lucky they get. And we do see clubs that consistently overperform and are consistently able to drive more consistent, more disciplined decision making, underpinned by some sense of competitive edge and some sense of what it costs in order to do that. And so, yeah, I mean, the poster boys for this, as I say, are Brighton and Brentford. But if you go back over the years in English football, you've had clubs like Bolton Wanderers do it, you know, under Sam Allardyce. You've had clubs like Southampton do it when Les Reed was in the seat there. You've had, you know, clubs like even Arsenal more recently have been able to kind of outperform their budget if you look at their actual spend numbers compared to what the likes of City, Chelsea, and Liverpool have been doing. So fundamentally, we believe it's possible for clubs to outperform their budget, but they need a plan. And that's where a lot of clubs fall down. They just simply don't have a plan. They believe that individual decisions will be the thing that catapults them to success, and quite often that's really not the case.
One of the points Omar makes, Charlie, is that club owners, directors have to differentiate between noise and signal when things perhaps go wrong, and when the fans and social media are clamoring, let's say, for a managerial departure. How much of that is just noise? How much is signal? But you must know from your time, let's say, at Sunderland versus your time at Charlton, that some clubs do seem to generate a lot more noise than others. And as an owner, as a director, it must be incredibly difficult to just say to the noise, I'm not listening to you, because you're living there in real time.
Yes, that's absolutely correct, Adrian. I'd actually say Charlton actually does generate a fair amount of noise. I remember their notorious campaign to defenestrate their owner, Roland Duchelet, which led to them, a group of fans attacking a restaurant that he was eating in Belgium. So it's not a quiet club by any stretch of imagination. Oxford United, where I was before then, would probably be a better example of a club where you don't get a lot of noise and you're able to operate in a much more sort of sensible way. It is slightly a function of experience. It's one of those things when it happens to you first, when you're hit by the noise first, it is profoundly discombobulating. Most people who are owners or chief executives coming into football effectively, unlike players who have been exposed to noise from a very early age, owners and directors have generally come from industries where you basically don't really have a huge amount of exposure to the public, to the general populace view of you, of your business, of the way in which you run your business, etc. So the first time it happens, it's really quite difficult and quite discombobulating. Once you've come through it once, then from then on, if really, hopefully, you should learn that actually you need to be able to say blah, 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 and put your hand up to the outside world. I mean, there is a sort of dirty truth amongst football club chief executives. I remember quite early on in some group that we all had together, and we were discussing, what to do when you're in a 50-50 situation. Could go this way, could go that way. And the consensus of the meeting was ask the fans what they think and do the opposite, and you generally won't be too far wrong. So you can get there in the end. I'll tell you one of the biggest problems, actually, for those of us who I'm more of a chief executive and more of a sort of small minority owner, so I operate more as a chief executive. More often, actually, the hardest thing is convincing the ultimate owner or the ultimate investor to ignore the noise. However much you warn them, they spend all their time reading online forums. It's absolutely exasperating. I never read them at all. I mean, for me, that's equivalent to the 1990s of finding the pub nearest the ground and going to the far end of the bar where the oddest, strangest, shoutiest fan is stood on his own with no mates around him whatsoever and saying, I'll tell you what, can you give us 20 minutes of your time? I mean, that is what it's like. And yet it's very, very difficult. What you'll find often is a new owner has got various friends and family around him who are looking around to see what fans think about the owner. The only way that they can find that information is by finding the fans forum, right? And there they find the craziest, most ill-informed, bonkers fans possible operating on rumours and various different things. And also, frankly, the people who've got the time to spend on online forums. And then they try and take their advice. So, yeah, it is difficult. It does take time, but it is absolutely essential to block out the noise.
Omar, how do you... Yeah, go on.
I was going to say, I'll give you an example. So we work with an ownership group that was new to Charlie's point, coming into football. This was about 3 years ago or so, out in one of the big 5 leagues, and the club had ambitions to play in the Champions League. And it got to the January window, and they were sitting kind of just above mid-table, I think 7th or 8th in the league. And we estimated that it was about a 1 in 7 chance of making the top 4 that season, and that even if you improved to be performing at a top 4 level, you're still only looking at a 1 in 5 chance of being in the Champions League. And those probabilities are such, they're low because of the randomness of football. You really can't guarantee anything in football. You might spend a lot of money, but you actually only can ever really move the odds by a small amount, particularly with only, 18, 17 games left in the season. And so we were trying to rationalize with them, the amount that they need to be spending in this window and say, January, you pay a premium for players. I think we've got a stat in the book that 28% of strikers signed in January don't even score a goal over the rest of the season. So you end up paying a lot for players who aren't actually performing. And B, trying to get to the kind of core objectives of what they want to achieve. And I think they instinctively recognized that Champions League football was unlikely, given the quality of other teams in the league. But they were speaking very much in the terms that Charlie was describing there around, we need some momentum in the season. We need to get the fans back on our side. We need a bit of kind of positivity around the club. And that's fine. And that's a perfectly legitimate objective. But you don't need to spend high 8-figure sums on a player in order to do that, in a market that commands a premium. And the club didn't make the Champions League, and it wouldn't surprise you to hear that. And they're kind of dealing with, and because in the kind of financial fair play era as well, you're dealing with very costly mistakes off the back of that you have to kind of unwind. So it is a challenge. I totally understand and recognize that challenge. It is unlike any other industry in that respect. But coming back to some basis of a plan has to be your starting point, rather than, as Charlie says, seeing what the latest opinion on the fan forum is and going based on that.
And when you talk about plan as well, I think you identify that in League One, to simply compete, to be there, you've got to spend at least £4 million a season, be prepared to write off £4 million a season. In the Championship, you're looking at a loss of £10 million a season on average. That's simply the price of competing. It sounds crazy, but you make the point to prospective owners, it's no good just looking at your buy-in price, how much the club costs to purchase, but you've got to accept that if you're in the Championship, there will be a £10 million cost per season. In League One, it will be £4 million per season. So when you look at how much you're willing to invest in a club, you've got to factor that in and say, well, for how many years are you willing to write off £10 million over 7 years? That's 70 million quid on top of your initial investment. And certainly my observation as a fan is there have been owners, and particularly the Chinese owners who came into English football, who just didn't quite grasp that. I mean, I find that incredible that they didn't, but I don't think they did, truthfully.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that a lot of owners have come into football for is they've seen the media rights going up and up and up at the top end. They have seen what US franchise prices, if you look at the kind of American capital, they go, that's quite expensive and it's probably rising at a similar rate. So why don't we go into Europe and take advantage of that? And if we can get to the top division, Premier League, we take advantage of it. But if you take Sheffield Wednesday as an example, a club in the news at the moment, and a lot of people, if people were to say, okay, what's your kind of 20 Premier League clubs, like, that you consider Premier League clubs, and Sheffield Wednesday would be on a lot of people's list just because of the history of the club, the size of the club, size of the stadium, etc. And so you think naturally that the club should relatively quickly get back up to the Premier League with relatively sensible ownership. But we ran some analysis on this a couple of weeks ago, looking at like what would it take to just get Sheffield Wednesday to have a 50-50 chance of the Premier League within 8 years. And essentially it was two things. So firstly, you have to be prepared to lose about 100 million, recognizing they're going to go down to League One, almost certainly going to be in the Championship for a few years. But then in order to lose 100 million, you also have to be one of probably the top 10% of well-operated teams in the EFL. And that still only gives you a 50-50 chance of promotion. So you have to be able to spend a lot of money and spend it really, really well to only have a 50-50 chance in the league. And when we talk about being in the top 10% of well-operated teams, that means essentially consistently making smart decision-making, finding undervalued talent, developing your players, finding the right head coach fit, like getting all that stuff pretty right most of the time. So it just shows like the level of commitment that's required in order to get, from a valuation of whatever it is today, 20, 40, 50 million to 250 million. It's a lot you need to get right and a lot of costs you have to bear.
I agree with so much of what you say, but I don't think that's entirely right. And you might expect me to say that because effectively I'm the last person to have achieved this with Sunderland, if you think about it. So we took over Sunderland 7 years ago, and Sunderland are now in the top 6 in the Premier League. And we took over Sunderland in almost identical circumstances to what Sheffield Wednesday is in right now. They finished bottom of the Premier League and then bottom of the Championship by 7 or 8 points. And we're now in League One with a big fan base and a big stadium, but with problems everywhere, huge losses. In fact, worse problems than Sheffield Wednesday, because effectively the club was losing 27 million quid a year, whereas Sheffield Wednesday got almost no players left. So that at least not starting from the position of having Jack Rodwell sat in the dressing room on 2 million quid a year in League One, not even playing, and so on and so forth. You do have immense benefits, though. I mean, we were able to have the second highest wage budget in League One on a break-even basis. And so when you talk about losing £100 million, I would say between when Stuart and I were there with Juan and then when Kirill came in, and then now Kirill and Juan have taken it forward, the total amount invested in Sunderland to the point of their arrival in the Premier League net would probably be, I'm guessing, about 40 million, something like that. It would not be much more than that. And that was include 10 million quid from COVID as well. Now, during that time, there have been significant player sales, because if you are getting things roughly right as you ascend, then your players will become of more interest to clubs a little bit further up the pile. So probably net player transfers during that time would be, significantly in Sunderland's favour. But even if you took that out, it would be about 50 million quid. And the reason for it actually is quite simply going through your book. I was like, yeah, this is pretty much everything that we had to do, more or less, sort of start to finish, even going into things like how deep your squad is and not paying too much for the final 5 players in your squad and making sure that those are filled by players coming up through your youth system. All of that kind of detailing is exactly how you don't end up losing that much money. So I would say that whilst on a normal basis, it might be true that the club or an ownership group in that situation might have to think about spending £100 million. Honestly, think if they just took your book and applied it in a sensible way with the correct size of fan base, I don't think it would be, Omar. I really don't. And I think that's almost the beauty of the book, is it pretty much tells you how you don't need to go and do what everybody else is doing, because there are actually all sorts of different ways in which you can just disintermediate that entire cash burning process. And of course, Adrian and I have discussed many times how the advent of cost controls, stricter and stricter cost controls, are going to be chopping down the amount in which people are even allowed to lose, let alone might want to lose. There's one chapter that I say it's the only one. I wouldn't say I disagree with it, but I want to explore it a bit because it's come up on the podcast before, and it's the one which I felt was written with. It's a very short one. It's only one page, but it does then come up in another place as well, and it's about multi-club ownership. To summarize it as I see it, and you can put me right if I've got this wrong, is the summary of what you say is, for sure, don't plunge into thinking that a multi-club ownership model is simply, quote, the answer, right? And I think we can all ride with that concept. But you then basically say is that it's difficult to get right. Okay, I think we can all ride with that concept. And then you say, so don't do it. Because although Red Bull and various others have done it really well, don't do it. Now, my challenge to that would be that as the availability of players who are, relatively speaking, a bit cheaper to be able to move your club forward without you blowing the bank becomes harder and harder, particularly with post-Brexit football immigration rules. Your ability simply to bring in a whole bunch of top young players relatively cheaply, garage them, and then play them forward, etc., like that, has become much, much harder. But I think going forward, my own perspective, and I would say this, I'm effectively operating a multi-club model for the first time right now. We're already seeing how this actually is really advantageous. Now, you make the point in here, which is that you've got to make sure the steps in the model are correct. But then effectively you almost then say, so don't bother doing it because you have to make sure the steps are correct. But I was like, no, like it is there for you, but you do have to make sure the steps are correct. Is that a fair summary of where you are?
Yeah, it's a really good summary. I think what we're saying is that your default position shouldn't be multi-club ownership is the solution to all your challenges around the pathway. Whereas I think a lot of investors come in with the default position that it is. So that throughout the book, we try and be a bit provocative around, particularly where we're challenging the status quo. I think there's a few things. So firstly, when we review the market of multi-club ownership, the idea of multi-club ownership is it makes you more efficient. It makes you, on a pound for pound, a better performing football club. And we just don't see that on the whole. And that's probably a function of still relatively immature as a space, multi-club ownership, but also the kind of complexity that exists within it. The second bit is talent pathways are complicated. They're not easy to get right. And it's a combination of, as you say, Charlie, like getting the steps right throughout a talent pathway, recognizing that you're dealing with humans and humans have different needs and different requirements. So some might benefit from a loan environment, some might benefit from a B team environment, some might benefit being thrown in the deep end, others need a bit more cotton wool wrapped around them, etc., etc. And so just having one club as a solution to that is never going to be.
Should we just unpack that a bit for Adrian? Should we just unpack that a bit for Adrian with like a real world example of when a group doesn't get it quite right in terms of, well, if we get a player in at this level and then they play it in our team here at that level, and then if they do well there, then they automatically, or they should automatically graduate to our team at that level. Is it just worth unpacking that to make it sort of real life?
Yeah, I mean, just look at Manchester City and the City Football Group, which has got a lot right. Let's not be wrong from a multi-club ownership perspective, because they've got big centralized functions that enable their individual teams to perform relatively well, and they're able to kind of distribute this kind of core central IP really, really well. But the fact is they've got very few players into the Manchester City first team, because ultimately Manchester City are performing at such a high level. If you look at the level of clubs they're recruiting from, they're essentially recruiting from other Champions League, maybe good Europa League clubs. And it's hard to have other clubs in your group at that level consistently performing at that level, let alone the regulatory challenges that come with that. So that's, obviously at the top end, that's really, really hard if you're a Manchester City. But there are other clubs as well. I mean, even if you take a Brentford and Midtjylland, who were part of a multi-club group, there wasn't much movement between those two clubs. Partly because they were kind of at the same level. Okay, maybe Brentford have a slightly higher wage bill because they've been in a kind of bigger market, as it were. But there wasn't much movement from a talent perspective. Ultimately, they were able to kind of optimize the performance of both teams again because they've got core IP that they're able to scale and grow value for both clubs through Matthew Benham's business.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. I think that's absolutely fascinating because I think that this might be a core point, right? Which is that what are you using it for,
Yes.
right? So I think there is a really interesting role in a multi-club model for solving the complicated jigsaw puzzle of how you get a club promoted from the Championship to the Premier League. Because the likelihood of you being able to source the types of players who can disintermediate the top end of the Championship is actually reasonably high. Like you can find those types of players, and it's interesting. Some of the markets you talk about in here, which I think Adrian will be interested in, some of the cheaper markets that are undervalued right now. You could find players from those markets and bring them into your feeder club, let's say in the Belgian top division or the Portuguese top division, or same where it might be, and they would then be able to come into West Bromwich Albion and push West Bromwich Albion forward, having come in at a low wage and low cost, etc. But what you're saying is that when you then get up into the upper reaches of the Premier League, the standard is so high that actually basically what you're doing is you're recruiting for the best teams in Europe, even if you're Brentford. Even if you're Brentford, you're basically going and saying, who's Athletic Bilbao's current right wing? So therefore, it's really difficult to rely on producing players of that kind. Adrian, have you got any thoughts on this area?
Well, I do, because I think, and I think one voice missing from the conversation so far is that of the fans. And certainly one very controversial multi-club ownership model at the moment is Strasbourg, who have a link there, owned by Blueco, who I think are Chelsea's owners. They're owned by Todd Bowley, effectively Chelsea's owner, and Clearlake Capital. And many Strasbourg fans, even though Chelsea dispute this, feel that their club has become a feeder club for Chelsea. Now, in the great chain of football, Chelsea are unquestionably a bigger club than Strasbourg. But I think the view of Strasbourg fans is they would sooner take their chances without the involvement of Chelsea's owners. So I think there's a lot of fan pushback against multi-club ownership. And just unpacking as well the conversation earlier, Omar, about what we describe as noise versus signal from supporters. Without that noise, without those supporters, football doesn't really exist, does it? There is no return on investment for the people who you advise.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fan is kind of central to the whole economy. Is the reason we're having this pod, right? Like we wouldn't have enough money in the game, enough interest in the game, unless there was kind of fandom in the game. So, I think owners absolutely have to recognize that and recognize the fact that they are part of an ecosystem that's driving value, and that value is realized through the monetization of fans. And so you have to kind of protect that, even if your individual segment doesn't necessarily make as big a difference. If we talk about media rights and sponsorship rights, etc., as an ownership group, you have to kind of think about that and consider it. So I obviously have a lot of sympathy with fan groups that feel that the identity of their club is being stripped out, and they're being used as part of the multi-club ownership group. In the case of Strasbourg, they are, it's a kind of double-edged sword, because they're probably having the greatest seasons in their history at the moment, right? They're competing in Europe, they're beating some of the biggest teams in Europe. And so that there's a lot of obviously benefit that comes from that as a fan, but there is a number of, as I say, identity challenges. So I think good ownership really recognizes that, tries to lean into the supporter groups, and tries to kind of make sure that fans feel heard as part of the picture. But to Charlie's point, making sure that they're kind of clear on the value that they're trying to drive, and executing that pretty ruthlessly.
We try and knock down some myths. There's some stuff in this book which might regularly be in people's minds as reality, which data proves is not reality. So things like, and I think this will be a really interesting one given the time of year we're at, is that sacking a new manager and getting a new manager bounce. What does the data look like in terms of that, Omar?
Yeah, so fundamentally, as I mentioned earlier, football's a low-scoring sport, which means that the the better team can often lose, and that won't happen. You never watch a tennis match and thought, oh, player X or Carlos Alcaraz played that player off the park and then didn't win. It just doesn't happen, but it happens all the time in football. And
I mean,
because of the
that's a really
sheer
interesting point, I think, Omar. In a sense, it can't happen in tennis. If you play the other player off the park, you win by definition. And
exactly.
we've all seen football matches where our team has had, I don't know, 80% possession, has peppered the goal, and yet has somehow lost. And I think you make the point that's almost unique in major world sports.
I think it's what makes football so popular, because the idea that an underdog has a chance, whether it's at Champions League level or on the park, right? When you're playing with mates, it's like that's the kind of fundamental part of football that makes it so unique. But what it means is that when you've got thousands and thousands and millions of football matches happening around the world, there's going to be some teams that are just consistently unlucky. They play well 3, 4 weeks in a row and they drop points and they don't win. And quite often that results in a head coach losing his job and a new head coach coming in and us seeing an improvement in performance or seeing an improvement in performance, certainly an improvement in results. But actually, if you look at the data, quite often a head coach is sacked, resigns, whatever it is, after a period of bad luck. Essentially, they've been performing well and hadn't got the results. And you have this what you call regression to the mean, where the new coach comes in and benefits from the team essentially performing at a pretty similar level to how they were under the new coach, but essentially getting luck evening itself out, which it will tend to do. I think it's really interesting. We got some examples in the book where you have teams that have been performing as the third or fourth best team in the league, are finishing 16th, 17th. I mean, Borussia Dortmund in Klopp's last season were bottom of the Bundesliga, but their underlying performance was probably third or fourth best in the Bundesliga at the time. The only reason they didn't sack Jurgen Klopp is obviously he had a huge amount of success, but any other club that coach would go and they'd be paying a lot of money in order to kind of, essentially achieve something that might have happened and probably would have happened anyway. So really thinking methodically about head coach changes is critical. And we've been working with a League One club recently who have been contemplating changing the head coach and really trying to break apart. Okay, what would you expect based on your spend? What would you expect based on the quality of the squad? How will you be actually performing? Kind of merging those three things together to get a triangulation of like, what should you really be expecting here? And yes, your results might be mid-table or whatever it is, but actually you're performing at a better level than that, and your squad is better than that, and therefore things will get better. So really critically assessing that and not just reacting to the fan noise on a Saturday afternoon.
I actually just want to read out the data points. I want to read out the data points very quickly because it really illustrates this clearly. So in the 6 games before a sacking, coaches average, on average, obviously, 0.9 points per game, right? Just under a point per game, they get fired. Their underlying performance, by which you mean XG, I suspect, right, would deserve 1.1 points per game, right? And then the incoming coach, on average, gets 1.2 points per game. So in other words, and then after that, it reverts back to 1.1 points per game, right? So what we're talking about here is tiny, tiny, tiny margins, mostly the biggest single factor being an individual run of luck.
Exactly that. And you're paying a lot of money to get rid of the coach and its staff in order to essentially get a brief increase in 0.1 points per game over a small number of games, which ultimately talking about like maybe an extra point, which could be important. But what that stat doesn't recognize is, again, the variability around that as well, because the new coach may come in and not deliver that. And that's part of the uncertainty of the sport.
Omar, if people want to get hold of this book and they're not football investors or football owners, how can they do that?
Yeah, so we're actually providing on a kind of exclusive delivery at the moment for our clients and for our partners and friends in the industry. But we will be sharing a lot of the insights through our social channels and through, I guess, mediums like this over the coming weeks and months. But we really feel strongly about our kind of ability to work with people to kind of embed these ideas, and so we want it to be something that people kind of value and appreciate. So yeah, it will be one, I guess, to have in a conversation with myself and my colleagues over the coming months.
Okay, so we're getting hot insights here then that you can't really get anywhere else unless you are a football club owner or investor. But if you want to follow 21st Group on their socials, you might get a little bit more. Thank you for that, Omar. And thank you, Charlie. We'll be back again next week with our more regular output, but it's been a fascinating insight into the world of football ownership. And just to say as well, if you're looking for a Christmas present, don't forget my book, Where's the Money Gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football is available now via Byline Books, an essential buy for Christmas. Great to speak to you, Omar. Thank you for your time. And I'll see you next week, Charlie. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.